where the excitement, it just gets the better of you. At the end of the day, if you're a fan of any sport, of any competitive environment, that excitement will always grab hold of you. And the moment it doesn't is the moment that you stop. And you hear drivers talk about like enjoying the sport. Oh, I'm not enjoying my football. I'm not enjoying my driving. The moment they stop enjoying it is the moment they should stop, because they're no longer there because they want to be there. They're there because they're paid to be there. And in a sport like Formula One, you have to be very careful with that, because obviously it's a very dangerous thing to be doing. If you've got someone just sort of 50%ing it around the lap because their head's not quite in it, that's dangerous to the other competitors and to the competitor themselves. But back to your question, like the moments, they still get hold of me. I still get furious about things. I still get elated about things. Before every race, I get super nervous. That tension before the lights come on, it's just that climax, because you don't quite know what's going to happen. Who's going to make a good start? You know, what if the front row guy makes a really slow getaway? What if the guy in fifth gets an absolute rocket of a start and leads? We saw Fernando Alonso absolutely nail starts at the next track that we're going to in Barcelona. I remember his start, I think it was 2011, he started fourth and he come out in the lead because they had the KERS button and he just dumped the whole thing. So there's always that element of anticipation and what's going to happen next. And you don't always get it in sport. It doesn't always give you that moment. So like in a football match, your team could be playing really, really well, creating loads of chances, but the game ends 0-0. In a Grand Prix, you could have a duel for the lead, like we saw with Leclerc and Verstappen in Miami after the safety car. You could have a duel for the lead, but there's never that pass. There's never that moment where, oh, is he gonna go for it? Is he gonna get there? But sport isn't always. It's like that sometimes. It doesn't always give you that moment. But then there'll be other races where it's just chaos everywhere. You don't know which way to look. So it all balances out in the end.
Indeed. So you were talking earlier about the fact that drivers and in fact people, of any level sometimes sort of get a bit, sick of what they're doing. Have there ever been moments in your journalism career so far where you've kind of felt undermotivated, or like you weren't really enjoying what you were putting out?
No, because I'm quite early into my journalism stages, so I suppose that could come later on in my career. So I'd have to say at the moment no, because I'm loving what I do. It's all fresh, it's all new. There's so many possibilities. I'm meeting so many like-minded people, because growing up, I knew zero people who followed Formula One. And now through the beauty of Twitter and Instagram and podcasting and now my journalism, I'm meeting more and more people who follow Formula One, who we can discuss it with and keep it all amicable, which is really important, because, you can have differing opinions. So, as long as I can have a sensible conversation with someone, then I'm absolutely up for it. If people are just going to start throwing mud, then you're not really going to get very far, because they're trying to make it a one-sided argument. But at the moment, thoroughly motivated to write and to inform and just enjoy what I'm doing, which is really important. If you enjoy what you do, then you're winning.
You're talking a bit about like throwing mud and kind of people talking almost senselessly about one side or the other. What was your personal response to the Abu Dhabi incident of last year? And do you feel like the reaction from Formula One fans as a whole, not just obviously the mistake of Michael Massey, but do you think that the reaction from Formula One fandom on Twitter was unreasonable?
To be honest, I stayed away from social media in the hours after it, because I was a little bit in shock. Didn't really know quite how to compress what had happened. There was the actual event itself. Then there was okay, how on earth does this untangle itself? Is Verstappen the world champion? Are they going to have to turn this around in the courts? Is it going to be 2022 by the time we get a decision? there was my personal feelings about it. And my favorite driver is Lewis Hamilton. I followed his career the whole way through. So on a personal level, it was really painful. From putting like my sensible head on and looking at it sort of coldly, and you can see where the mistake is. You can see why Verstappen fans were talking about what had happened rather than their driver winning the world championship, which I think is fair because Verstappen was a deserving champion, not in that fashion. I don't think anyone would want to win in that fashion. But there's an element of, everyone has to understand what's going on. And this is the problem with social media. People tend to get a bit carried away and they get drawn into these arguments. So you have to be very careful the way you approach things. And sometimes I'll write a tweet and then I'll look at it and go, hang on, that might not work. That might be worded wrongly. So maybe I won't tweet it. It's always the old adage, like speak to others how you want to be spoken to. So if you start putting inflammatory comments out on your Twitter or Facebook or social media feed, don't be surprised when people start throwing fire back at you, because you're asking for it. Basically, if you put out a well-considered, thoughtful tweet, then yes, someone might have an issue with it, but as long as you can then sort of
justify it.
Yeah, justify it. And if you can like converse with them, and I know it's tricky because you can't convey tone in text, but emojis are helpful. I found that they're very useful. But it is difficult because you don't know who you're talking to. So there is always that. And like in the heat of the moment, people do say things that they don't mean. So you do have to be careful, which is why sort of when I tweet more as a journalist rather than as a person and giving my own feelings on things, because I'm just there to help inform. I'm there to give insight, to give a little bit of my opinion. If I think something's wrong, I'll say it. But again, I'm not going to go over the top and say, oh, well, this driver, oh gosh, he should be sacked because, he's clearly terrible. I'd never go that far because, for one, I can't drive one of those cars nearly as fast as they can. And second of all, you don't know what's going on in people's lives. So there's so much going on. And sometimes people tweet because they're having a bad day, and people throwing stuff at them doesn't really help. You have to consider other people's feelings. And if the pandemic has taught us anything, we should be considerate, because time with people can be short. And I know that sounds a bit morbid, but we have to take the lessons from these things, and we have to remember that everyone is human. So if you start sort of going over the top with people on Twitter because they have an opinion on something, if you can't debate it reasonably, then just don't bother.
Yeah, 100%. And we've talked a bit about Formula One last year and the events that took place. What about Formula One in 2022? What were your initial expectations after the announcement of the huge regulations overhaul? Who did you think was going to be on top? Who do you think was going to be less fortunate?
Well, I was hoping that Mercedes would be up there because obviously my favourite driver is Lewis Hamilton, and therefore Mercedes are my favourite team. But it's nice to see Ferrari up there. I had a feeling that this would put them back at the front. They'd have been able to write off 2020 and to some extent 2021, and they've come out with a very good car. I am surprised at how good the Red Bull is, considering that they had such a massive title fight with Mercedes last year. But then Mercedes, if they get that car sorted out, I think it's pretty good. So for those two teams to have delivered in the way they have is very, very impressive. Because if you think back to 2009, where McLaren and Ferrari were head-to-head in 2008, they both produced sort of middle of the road cars, and it was Brawn and Red Bull and Toyota who got the jump on everybody. Okay, there was the double diffuser, and I think they tried to close off as many loopholes for this set of regulations as possible. But it's still interesting in the fact that Ferrari have come back to the front, and it gives two new drivers the opportunity to be at the front. And there's that story of Verstappen and Leclerc from their junior days, and now they get to go head to head in Formula One. And what would be very nice to see is if McLaren can get their car up to speed as well, and Mercedes, and then you have Norris and you have Russell join the party. So there's all these different storylines there, and we're still very early in the 2022 regulations, so we shouldn't judge them just yet. But from what I've seen so far, it's been pretty good. The field tends to be a little bit closer than it was, especially last year. I mean, Haas were lagging way off the back, and there was reasons for that. But as soon as you make it more a ground effect formula, we've seen the competitive nature of the field close up a little bit, which in many ways is very, very good, because we saw drivers make errors or have poor qualifyings in Miami. And then we had Stroll and there was Tsunoda getting into Q3. Bottas got through. Obviously, Bottas had a good car. But, you've got to earn it in that midfield now, which is really, really good. And if the fight at the front can be just as impressive, then that is absolute gold for Formula One. And we saw that because Verstappen made one error and he lost pole position.
And speaking of a great fight at the front, George Russell has had an incredible season, I think, personally, so far. As his first year as a Mercedes driver, 5 top 5 finishes out of 5. Do you think that he has the racing skill to be able to match, if not surpass, Lewis Hamilton this year in points?
He has the ability. Whether it will come to pass or not is another question, because you've got to factor in where Lewis is at the moment. For me, I don't think this is a 100% fully firing Lewis, mostly because of the car. But as I said in my last episode, I think there's a bit of a hangover for him from Abu Dhabi. I don't think he's fully motivated, because why would you be motivated for P6 or P5 when you are so used to winning? His brain is conditioned to win. All of these drivers are built to win, and that's why they can't process hanging it in the midfield. Some drivers can adapt to that, but it takes them a little while to get their head around it. For Lewis, the only way to consider being successful is by winning races and winning world championships. Obviously, he can't do that every year. That would be impossible, because that's the law of the jungle. You can't stay on top forever. But back to the George Russell question, he has delivered brilliantly in the first 5 races. He has, I think, actually exceeded expectations. Yes, he's beaten Lewis, but he's been close to Lewis regularly on pace. And I think that speaks volumes for how Mercedes have prepared him. So if you look back to how McLaren prepared Lewis, it's a very similar story with George. Okay, there's some differences, but preparing someone to go into a top team with the expectation of winning immediately it's not easy. And we saw Ferrari do it with Leclerc, and it sort of go a little bit awry with his relationship with Vettel. Well, Vettel was sort of having his own issues. But we've seen drivers be put in these top positions and then falter. It's not easy to put someone in that position, but George has delivered. He's got broad shoulders. He takes the pressure. And if you want to see just how good he is and how good he can be, just look at his Sakir 2020 performance. He didn't fit the car. He'd not driven that car. And he qualified within a tenth of a second of Bottas, who'd been driving that car all year. And then he was on course to win the race. Okay, the racing gods were against him on that evening. But if you put George Russell at the front of a race again, you better be expecting a win, because he is very capable. And look back to his Formula 2 and GP3 days. He won both of those titles consecutively. And it's easy to bandy about the tag of future world champion, but if anyone's going to win a championship for Mercedes after Lewis Hamilton, it really could be George Russell. But then there's so much competition around in Formula One at the moment. And that's healthy, because you don't want Russell to end up at the front and there be a lack of competition and go, well, how good was he really? Could someone have put him under more pressure? Because then we'll never really have an answer. If he beats Verstappen and Leclerc and Norris in a fair fight, then you know exactly how good he is.
On the subject of the new generation of Formula One, as we can see from last weekend's Miami Grand Prix, F1 is on a mission to expand into the United States.